I was 29 the day I caught myself reminiscing about our old front porch, the one with the creaking boards and peeling white paint. For some reason, I remembered the exact smell of the wooden steps after a summer rain, the way it mixed with the scent of my dad's aftershave when he came home from work. Back then, home still felt like home, even though my parents had always leaned heavily toward my twin brother, Brian. As a kid, I was just too hopeful to notice the imbalance. Brian and I were born minutes apart, but if you listen to my mom, Linda, you'd think he arrived on a golden chariot and I was the afterthought. She and Dad, Richard, treated him like he was destined for greatness, top of his class, star of every conversation. While I was, at best, some supporting character in his story, I loved him in the way you naturally love a twin. But by the time we turned 10, his smug glances told me he liked being put on a pedestal. And if I even hinted that it was unfair, he'd laugh it off or roll his eyes like I was an annoying cat that wouldn't stop meowing. My earliest memory of feeling sidelined was on our 10th birthday party. Mom made Brian a towering chocolate cake, complete with fancy lettering and edible gold flecks. Meanwhile, my cake was a smaller vanilla one, shoved in the corner like an afterthought. I pretended I didn't care, focusing on how the candles sparkled in the semi-dark living room, but I remember blinking back tears. Brian was surrounded by half the neighborhood kids, tearing open presents I never even knew existed. I sat at the edge of the couch, picking at the frilly hem of my dress, trying not to feel the sting of being invisible. Grandma Eloise noticed, though. She always did. She was my dad's mother, and even though she lived an hour away, she visited whenever she could. I recall her arriving late that night, breathless from the drive, carrying a small wrapped box and an apology for missing most of the celebration. Brian barely acknowledged her. I guess he was too busy showing off his new gaming console to his friends. But Grandma snuck over to me, brushed my hair back, and placed the box in my hands. Inside was a handmade bracelet with small silver charms, hardly expensive, but it made me feel special in a way I never felt with my own parents. That night, while Brian and his crowd were still in the backyard playing a rowdy game of tag, Grandma asked me to show her around the house. I led her through the cluttered living room, decorated exclusively with Brian's achievements, his spelling bee trophies, his perfect attendance certificates, even a framed picture of him winning some local math competition. My dad was so proud of him he'd laminated every newspaper clipping. Grandma's eyes darted around, and she gave a tiny shake of her head, like she couldn't believe it. Then she turned to me and said, "I see you, sweetheart. You're important too." I didn't cry. Maybe I was too young to fully understand how desperately I needed to hear those words, but they sank into my heart. I remember pressing my bracelet against my palm and nodding, like I was silently agreeing to believe in myself, even if no one else at home did. As we got older, the gap widened. Brian was praised for studying late into the night, while I got told off for staying up too late with my soccer team group chat. My mother claimed I had no sense of purpose, which stung because I actually loved sports and being around people. I once overheard Dad on the phone, bragging to his coworker about Brian's intelligence, only to dismiss me as the free spirit in the family. The casualness of that hurt more than any direct insult. Still, I tried hard to keep the peace. I helped fold laundry on Saturdays, made sure to ask Mom about her day, tried to laugh at Dad's lame jokes. Sometimes Brian and I were okay. He'd let me borrow his games, or we'd watch some TV show together. But he quickly realized that if something went missing or got broken, our parents wouldn't question him. They'd blame me in a heartbeat. I watched him use that to his advantage more than once, especially when he started getting sneaky about skipping classes or losing money. I saw it happen, but I didn't know how to call him out without making everything worse. I guess I believed that if I was patient enough, they'd see my worth, that eventually Mom or Dad would realize they'd been unfair. But I was wrong. It was like running on a treadmill set to someone else's pace. I could never catch up, no matter how fast I sprinted. And by the time I hit my teens, the dynamic in the house was so skewed that trying to fix it felt like shouting into a void. Looking back, I wish I could tell my younger self, "Stay strong, kid. You're not crazy for feeling overlooked." But I can't change what happened. I can only remember the little details, like how the porch smelled after rain, or how Grandma's bracelet jangled when I walked, reminding me that somebody out there knew I mattered. By the time I turned 15, I'd learned to keep my head down around Brian. It was just easier. He had a knack for making himself look like the quiet, studious one, polite around teachers, quick with a respectful nod to our parents. Meanwhile, I ended up painted as the troublemaker, all because I'd roll my eyes whenever he got credit for something I'd done, or because I spent too much time talking with friends after school. I started staying out later, telling myself I was practicing soccer or finishing a group project, when really I just hated walking into a house where my brother's voice carried more weight than mine ever would. Grandma Eloise saw through it whenever she visited. She'd notice how I shuffled my feet when I answered the door, or how Brian's grin never reached his eyes when he greeted her. Once, she pulled me aside and asked if I was okay. She did it in such a gentle way. I remember her hand on my shoulder, the smell of lilac on her sweater. I tried to smile and say everything was fine, but I couldn't hide the twist in my stomach. Deep down, I wanted to tell her everything. The constant comparisons, the way my parents acted like Brian walked on water. Instead, I just nodded and changed the subject, because I was terrified of causing a family scene. The atmosphere in the house was changing, too. My dad, Richard, became more rigid about enforcing rules I'd never heard of before. No phone calls after 9, no hanging out with friends on weeknights, no more than an hour of television unless Brian wanted to watch something, in which case the rules suddenly didn't apply. Whenever I protested, Dad would say, "Don't start that attitude with me," as if my entire personality was some rebellious phase. My mom, Linda, wasn't any better. She'd hover by the kitchen doorway, listening to Brian talk about his extracurricular activities, praising him for staying focused on his future. Meanwhile, if I mentioned a soccer tournament or asked to join the swim team, she'd shake her head and claim it would pull my attention from real academics. One evening, after dinner, Brian and I both went to the living room. He took the couch first and spread out like he owned the place, so I settled on the floor with a leftover bowl of ice cream. I remember him making a snide remark about how I should probably be reading a textbook instead of stuffing my face. Linda overheard and joined in, telling me that if I wanted to be productive like my brother, I wouldn't be wasting time on sweets. I put the bowl aside, not even hungry anymore, and tried not to look as hurt as I felt. If I snapped back, I'd just prove them right about me being difficult. But staying silent made my heart pound with anger, and I had to leave the room before my eyes filled with tears. Moments like that chipped away at the little self-confidence I had. It got to the point where I dreaded dinner altogether, afraid of being compared to Brian's perfect posture and polite table manners. I'd pick at my food, swallowing more shame than actual dinner. Brian seemed to thrive on my discomfort, finding small ways to edge me out, taking the last serving of mashed potatoes if he noticed me eyeing it, or, accidentally, knocking my glass of water closer to the table's edge, so I had to keep an eye on it all evening. My parents either didn't notice or pretended not to. What kept me going were pockets of normalcy at school. I joined the soccer team, which gave me an excuse to stay out later and come home exhausted enough to head straight to my room. On the field, no one cared about how Brian acted or how my parents saw me. All that mattered was how well I passed the ball or sprinted toward the goal. My coach, Miss Jackson, told me I was quick on my feet and had a natural sense of timing. She'd grin and say, "You've got fire in you. Use it." I drank in that praise like a lifeline, relieved to know I wasn't invisible everywhere. Still, Brian's influence crept into my school life, too. He'd spread little rumors, telling classmates that I was moody or prone to sudden outbursts. To a few people, he implied I was lying about my achievements, whispering that I must have cheated on a test if I got a good grade. In hallways, I'd catch him glancing at me, then leaning into a friend's ear with a smirk. If I confronted him, he'd give me this wide-eyed look, as though he had no idea what I was talking about. There was a twisted satisfaction on his face when he saw me seething. One day I overheard him bragging to someone about how our dad always believed him over me. He said it casually, but there was a sharp edge to his voice. "She can whine all she wants," I heard him say, "but we all know who Dad trusts." My stomach twisted into a knot, and I had to duck into the nearest restroom to compose myself. That afternoon, I found myself scribbling in a notebook, venting my frustration in half-formed sentences and little sketches of angry faces. I felt ridiculous, a teenager with nowhere else to put her anger except on paper, but it helped for a moment. Grandma called me that night, checking in from her place an hour away. It was like she sensed I needed someone to talk to. I tried to pretend everything was fine, but my voice must have wavered because she asked, "Are you sure, honey?" I nearly broke down right then, ready to spill the whole story of Brian's manipulations, the constant favoritism, and how alone I felt. But all I managed was a quiet, "I'm okay," followed by a half-hearted laugh. She didn't push. She just told me she loved me and reminded me her doors were always open. After we hung up, I stared at my phone, wishing I had the courage to pack my things and move in with her. I told myself it wouldn't be fair. I'd be running away, leaving Brian to spin his stories unchallenged. A part of me still hoped to fix things. But late at night, I'd lie awake in bed, listening to the faint hum of the air conditioner, imagining a life where I wasn't constantly in Brian's shadow. I'd think about going to college somewhere far, meeting people who didn't know me as Brian's sister, who wouldn't compare me to his achievements. Sometimes those thoughts brought a sense of calm, like a promise that this phase wouldn't last forever. Other times, they made me feel bitter for even needing an escape plan from my own home. The next few weeks were a blur of soccer practices, silent dinners, and forced smiles whenever Brian pulled a stunt to get me in trouble. He told Mom I broke a vase he actually knocked over. He claimed Dad's missing $20 bill was in my bag when in reality he'd spent it on a new game. My attempts to defend myself fell flat. Linda accused me of playing the victim. Dad shook his head in disappointment, and Brian gloated quietly. I remember the storm cloud that gathered in my chest whenever I realized they'd once again taken his word over mine. It felt like everything was spiraling, yet I couldn't see how to stop it. Still, I clung to the idea that if I just stayed true to myself, kept my head up, held on to my sense of humor, played a decent game of soccer, eventually the truth might rise to the surface. Maybe it was naive, but it was the only hope I had left. Meanwhile, I waited for the day when I'd finally feel brave enough to tell Grandma I was done pretending everything at home was normal. I didn't know it then, but that moment was closer than I ever imagined. A single spark waiting to light up the whole facade Brian had so carefully built around us. A couple of weeks later, I came home from school to find Brian pacing around the living room, clutching a piece of paper. His face lit up when he saw me, but not in a friendly way, more like a cat who just caught a mouse. He walked right up, waved the paper, and declared, "Mom and Dad know about the pictures on your phone?" My heart pounded. I had no clue what he meant. I managed a cautious, "What pictures?" And he shrugged like he'd found top-secret evidence. "I told them you had inappropriate photos saved," he said, drawing out each word with theatrical emphasis. I stared in disbelief. It was another lie. My phone was mostly filled with random snapshots of soccer practice, some group selfies with my friends, and photos of Grandma's cat. But Brian didn't care about logic. He cared about the power trip he got every time he pinned me down with accusations. By the time our parents returned from work, my hands were shaking. Sure enough, they cornered me in the kitchen before I could even put my backpack away. Dad demanded my phone, his voice dangerously low. Mom kept glancing at Brian, who stood in the doorway, watching like a hawk. I had nothing to hide, but it didn't matter. Dad flipped through my camera roll as though he were sifting for contraband. Of course, there was nothing there, unless you considered a badly lit picture of my friend's birthday cake suspicious. Still, Dad frowned at every photo like he was expecting something vile to appear. After the fruitless search, Mom pulled Brian aside and whispered something to him, then looked at me and said, "Why would your brother say those things if they weren't true?" I felt the blood rush to my face. She was indirectly calling me a liar, again. I tried to defend myself, explaining Brian had a habit of cooking up stories for attention, but the words came out shaky. Brian pretended to be offended, putting on his most convincing, innocent expression. Dad gave me a speech about privacy and trust, ending with, "We'll be watching you." He didn't even acknowledge that Brian had basically slandered me. I left the kitchen furious, heat prickling the back of my neck. In my room, I threw my backpack onto the bed, wishing I could fling it through the wall. The injustice weighed on me. How could they brush off Brian's false accusations just because they expected the worst of me? It was like living in a rigged game, and I was running out of ways to keep my temper in check. That night, I tried journaling, something I hadn't done in a while. I scribbled half a page about how helpless I felt, how I wanted to scream every time I saw Brian's smug face. The pen nearly tore through the paper at one point. When I finished, I read it back and realized my handwriting wavered from neat lines to furious streaks. There was so much bottled-up rage inside me I barely recognized myself. I used to be more carefree, laughing with my soccer teammates without a worry. Now I felt like a cornered animal, constantly on guard. The next morning, Dad announced at breakfast that he'd scheduled a family meeting for that evening. Just me, Brian, and our parents. My stomach sank. We never had official meetings. It sounded like some corporate HR session. Brian cast me a sideways grin, and I knew it was his doing. He probably told them I was still hiding something. Sure enough, that evening, after dinner, they summoned me to the living room. The wall seemed to close in as Dad ordered Brian to explain his concerns, and Brian obliged, weaving a story about how I'd been sneaking out at night, hanging with shady people, possibly getting into trouble. He offered zero evidence, but Dad kept nodding as if each sentence was absolute truth. Mom then turned to me, arms crossed, demanding to know why I was acting out. I tried to stay calm, pointing out the obvious holes in Brian's claims, but they wouldn't listen. It felt like banging my head against a concrete wall. Finally, I raised my voice, a desperate move, but I couldn't help it. I told them this was insane, that Brian had no proof, and they should stop treating me like a criminal. The moment the words left my mouth, Dad's eyes flashed with anger. He said, "How dare you speak to us like that?" Brian's smirk widened. I realized I just handed him more ammunition. They lectured me for another half hour. Brian stood by, silent but satisfied, until Dad waved us off. "Go to your rooms," he snapped. "I don't want to hear another word." I stormed upstairs, my pulse hammering so loudly I could feel it in my ears. It wasn't just anger or hurt. It was a toxic mix of both, layered with a sense of betrayal. I locked my bedroom door, more to keep Brian out than anything else, and flopped onto the bed, staring at the cracks in the ceiling. Eventually, my phone buzzed. It was Grandma, texting to see if I needed anything. Tears blurred my vision as I typed back a shaky response. "I might have to leave. I can't live like this anymore." Before she could reply, I shut off the phone, almost afraid of the relief I might feel if she offered me a way out. Part of me wanted to hold on a little longer, prove that Brian's lies would collapse under their own weight. Another part wanted to run to Grandma's house and never come back. The next day at school, I tried to bury my frustration in class assignments. But soccer practice got canceled due to a thunderstorm, leaving me with an extra hour before I had to go home. I grabbed my backpack and lingered in the library, mindlessly flipping through reference books. My friend Jess noticed my tense expression and asked if I was okay. I hesitated, then admitted I was having issues at home. She looked concerned but didn't press. Just her gentle presence was enough to keep me from breaking down in the middle of the stacks. When I finally trudged home through the downpour, Dad barely glanced my way, and Mom asked if I'd managed to stay out of trouble. Brian was nowhere to be found. I headed to my room, thinking maybe the stormy weather would keep the household tension at bay. But shortly after I got settled, I heard a knock on my door. It was Brian, of course. He opened it without waiting for me to say anything, stepping in as though he owned the place. There was a moment of silence between us, filled by the faint rattle of rain against my window. Then he said quietly, almost too calmly, "Why don't you just give up trying to make them believe you? It's not worth it." I stared at him, confused. Was this some twisted show of pity, or a new tactic to mess with my head? He shrugged, adding, "They'll always take my word over yours." He said it like a fact of life, as if he were talking about gravity or the color of the sky. It felt like I'd just been punched in the gut. He left without waiting for a response, leaving me alone with the thunder outside and that crushing realization. In that instant, I knew. There was no winning as long as I stayed under the same roof with Brian. No argument, no proof, no heartfelt plea would make them see past his manipulations. If I wanted any sense of freedom, any chance to be seen for who I really was, I'd have to find it somewhere else. And maybe, just maybe, I was finally ready to admit that running away might be the bravest thing I could do. The morning after Brian slipped out of my room, I woke up to a hollow feeling in my chest. Outside, the sky was gray and bleak, matching my mood. I went through the motions of getting ready for school, brushed my teeth, pulled on a hoodie, stared at my reflection in the mirror until I realized my eyes looked puffy from crying in my sleep. My parents were in the kitchen, sipping coffee and discussing something quietly, but they stopped talking the moment I entered. Without a word, I grabbed a piece of toast and left for school earlier than usual, not caring that it was drizzling. As I walked, I thought about Brian's parting words. He told me it wasn't worth fighting for my parents' trust, that they'd always side with him. Deep down, I knew he was right, but part of me hated that he was so certain, like the whole situation was a game he'd already won. I reached the school gates feeling a kind of quiet resolve. If I couldn't change their minds, maybe it really was time to leave. But I didn't know when or how. Grandma's home was my only sanctuary, yet I wasn't sure if I'd be burdening her by moving in. At lunchtime, Jess and I sat outside on a low stone ledge near the cafeteria. The rain had stopped, leaving the air damp and smelling faintly of wet grass. She asked me how I was holding up. At first, I tried brushing it off with a joke, but she saw through me. Something in her gentle expression made me trust her enough to spill some of the truth. That Brian was constantly setting me up, that my parents never believed me, that I felt suffocated. Jess listened, occasionally shaking her head or offering a soft, "That's messed up." Nobody had ever really validated me like that before, so I found myself talking more than I intended, words tumbling out in fragments. I stopped short of telling her I was considering leaving home. Something told me that was a secret I should keep until I was certain. She didn't pressure me for more. Instead, she shared how her parents had divorced when she was younger and how she'd felt caught in the middle. It wasn't the same as my situation, but it reminded me that nobody's home life was perfect. We sat there until the bell rang, a fragile sense of camaraderie in the lingering silence. After school, I tried to head straight home, hoping to avoid any extra drama. But Brian managed to intercept me near my locker. He leaned against the metal door, arms crossed, a smug grin plastered on his face. "How's your day?" he asked, sounding almost friendly. The question made my skin crawl. I forced a neutral tone. "Fine. Move." He didn't budge, just tilted his head, like he was analyzing me. "You seem different," he said. "Not so eager to defend yourself." When I didn't reply, he smirked. "Maybe you've finally figured out it's pointless." I didn't dignify that with an answer, pushing past him with more force than necessary. My heart pounded as I walked away. If I had any lingering doubts about leaving, that look on his face was enough to remind me there was nothing left for me in that house. I got home to find Dad in the living room, paying bills on his laptop. The second he heard the front door, he asked if I'd seen Brian. Apparently, my brother had told him we were going to study together after class. The lies were endless. I shook my head, my throat tightening. "We're not exactly study buddies," I muttered, heading upstairs before he could respond. Once in my room, I locked the door and tried to breathe. My phone buzzed, a text from Grandma. "How are you, sweet girl? I've been thinking about you." My fingers hovered over the screen, and I finally typed, "Not good. Things are worse. Can I come visit this weekend?" She wrote back almost instantly, telling me I was welcome anytime, for as long as I needed. My vision blurred with tears of relief. The thought of her cozy little house filled with crocheted blankets and the smell of homemade muffins gave me a sliver of hope. A plan began to form in my head, one that felt both thrilling and terrifying. I'd pack a bag and go there, maybe just for a short break to clear my head, but I knew deep down it might be a one-way trip. That night, I tiptoed around the house like a stranger in my own home. Mom was watching TV with Brian, and Dad was busy in the garage. I took the chance to gather a few essentials, a change of clothes, some toiletries, the bracelet Grandma had given me years ago. Each item I tucked into my bag felt like a tiny act of rebellion. My hands trembled, but a strange calm settled over me. It was as if my mind had split. One part was terrified, the other laser-focused on what I had to do. I barely slept, waking up every few hours to listen for footsteps outside my door. half expecting someone to barge in demanding to know what I was up to. When morning finally came, I faked a headache to skip school. Dad grunted something about resting up as he left for work, while Mom rolled her eyes and mumbled about how I needed to be more responsible. Brian seemed indifferent, throwing on a backpack and heading out without so much as a goodbye. Once the house was empty, I sat on the edge of my bed, bag at my feet, taking in the room for what could be the last time. I thought about the happy moments here, no matter how few they were. Like the time I rearranged my furniture just to feel some sense of control, or the nights I stayed up reading under the covers, escaping into fictional worlds. Then I remembered Brian's smirks, the endless accusations, the hollow look on Dad's face whenever I tried to defend myself. My eyes stung with tears, but I wiped them away. I had to be strong, or I'd never make it out that door. I took a breath and grabbed my bag. Before leaving, I wrote a short note on a scrap of paper. I'm at Grandma's. Don't worry. It felt abrupt, but I didn't know them more than that. My heart thumped in my chest as I stepped onto the porch, that familiar creak echoing like a final goodbye. The sky was cloudless, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside me. I walked to the bus stop with my chin up, trying to look like I had a destination in mind, though my mind was a jumble of excitement, fear, and something that felt suspiciously like relief. When the bus arrived, I sank into a window seat, hugging my bag tight. Each mile we traveled away from that house, my shoulders felt lighter. A new thought took root in my head. Maybe this was the first step toward a life that belonged solely to me, not overshadowed by Brian's manipulations or my parents' willful blindness. I closed my eyes and let out a shaky breath, knowing I wasn't free yet, but at least I was on my way to finding a place where I could breathe again. I got off the bus 2 blocks from Grandma Eloise's place and immediately felt my shoulders relax. The neighborhood was quiet and tree-lined, so different from the tense hush back home. I could see Grandma's small cottage at the end of the street, the one with flower pots crammed onto every windowsill. The sight made my heart flutter with relief. I'd visited 100 times before, but this time was different. I was seeking refuge. She came to the door in a rush when I knocked, looking worried until she saw me standing there with my bag. Then her face softened, and she wrapped me in a hug so tight I thought I might cry. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured. "I'm so glad you're here." I think she could tell from my trembling hands that I was close to crumbling. She led me inside, scolding me for not telling her earlier I'd be coming in the morning. I shrugged off my jacket and tried to find the right words to explain everything, but my voice caught in my throat. Grandma ushered me into the cozy living room, where a crocheted blanket and a half-finished cup of tea sat waiting on the coffee table. Eventually, we settled on her floral print couch. I spilled the story in disjointed bursts: Brian's lies, Dad's constant suspicion, Mom's indifference, the note I left behind. The words tumbled out, raw and unfiltered, and my cheeks burned with both anger and embarrassment. Grandma listened without interrupting, nodding here and there to show she understood. When I finished, she pressed her lips together for a long moment, like she was trying to keep herself from launching into a rant. "I always suspected things were off," she said quietly. "I noticed how your brother seemed to twist situations, but I never realized it was this bad." Her eyes glistened with a mix of compassion and regret. "You should have come sooner," she added, though not unkindly. I let out a shaky sigh. I wanted to, but it felt like giving up. Like if I left, Brian would win. The admission felt childish, yet it was the truth. Grandma shook her head, reached for my hand, and said, "This isn't about winning or losing. This is about your well-being, darling." I swallowed a lump in my throat. I knew she was right, but some part of me still hated how everything had played out. After a while, she stood up, smoothed her skirt, and declared she'd make us some lunch. Real food, she insisted, because I looked like I hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. In her small, sunlit kitchen, she put together grilled cheese sandwiches and opened a jar of homemade tomato soup. The warm, savory smell started to chip away at the numbness inside me. I found myself leaning against the counter, telling her random details about school, about Jess, about soccer practice. It was strange how normal it felt, like we'd slipped into a routine we both knew by heart, even though my entire life had just turned upside down. At some point, Grandma's landline phone rang. We exchanged a look, knowing full well it might be my parents. She answered with a calm hello, and I saw her jaw tense. I couldn't make out Mom's words, but I heard Grandma's replies, yes, she's here, and she's safe. Then her voice turned firm. Well, she's staying with me for a while. You'll have to respect that. I braced myself, half expecting her to hand the phone over, but she kept talking, her voice unwavering. When she finally hung up, she sighed and shook her head. Your mother insists they want you home, she said, a hint of sarcasm in her tone. I told her you're old enough to decide where you want to be. She said they'd call back later. I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the floral placemats. They're just worried about Brian's reputation, I muttered. Not about me. Grandma placed a mug of tea in front of me, gently resting her hand on my shoulder. You don't have to justify a thing to them, she said softly. Just focus on getting some rest and clearing your head. The afternoon drifted by in a haze of comfort. I showered, changed into one of Grandma's oversized sweaters, and helped her water the potted herbs on the windowsill. She explained each plant, rosemary, thyme, mint, and teased me for not knowing the difference between parsley and cilantro. It was such a small, tender moment, but it grounded me. I felt a bit like a kid again, learning simple life lessons from someone who genuinely cared. In the evening, I tried to tackle some homework, but my thoughts kept turning to the possibility of returning to school. How would I face the whispers or Brian's smug gloating? Would he tell everyone I'd run away? Would my parents come bursting through Grandma's door, demanding I leave with them? My heart thumped just imagining it. That night, Grandma made sure the guest bed had fresh sheets, even though she'd practically prepared it for me long before I arrived. We sat together in the living room, lights dim, watching an old black and white movie that neither of us paid much attention to. She asked if I wanted to call Jess or anyone else. I shook my head, too drained to explain myself to friends who might or might not understand. Before heading to bed, I found Grandma flipping through an old photo album from when I was a toddler. She showed me a picture of me and Brian sitting in plastic kiddie chairs, grinning at the camera. It breaks my heart to see how far things have gone, she murmured. I nodded, feeling the sting of betrayal all over again. I don't know if I can ever forgive him, I admitted. Grandma didn't offer empty reassurances. She just squeezed my hand and said, you don't have to figure that out today. Late that night, I lay awake in the unfamiliar yet comforting silence. The house settled with soft creaks, and a breeze rustled the curtains. My phone remained off, resting on the side table. I half expected it to buzz with a barrage of messages from my parents or from Brian, but no vibrations came. The only light in the room came from the moon filtering through the window, reflecting on the charm bracelet Grandma had given me years ago. I tried to picture what tomorrow would bring. Part of me clung to the idea of transferring schools, starting fresh somewhere away from Brian's lies. Another part wanted to stand my ground, return to class, and prove I wasn't going to vanish just because of him. My thoughts swirled, not finding any solid landing place. But for the first time in ages, I felt safe enough to be uncertain. Grandma's house was my haven, even if the rest of the world was ready to pounce. As I drifted off, I promised myself one thing. Whatever came next, I'd do it on my terms, not Brian's, not my parents', and certainly not the rumors that clung to me like a shadow. If they wanted to call me difficult or rebellious, so be it. I was finally done bending over backward for a family that refused to see me. This was my life, my struggle, and I was determined to shape it into something that belonged to me, no matter how long it took. I woke up early to the sound of Grandma's phone ringing off the hook. Dad and Mom kept calling. They wanted me home, immediately. Brian sent a single text, "Don't make this harder than it has to be." My chest tightened, but I stood my ground. I told Grandma I was staying. She nodded, dialed them back, and calmly said I was free to choose. That evening, I gathered my courage and called my parents myself. My voice shook, but I told them I wouldn't return to the same cycle of lies. Brian tried to butt in, saying he'd explain everything. I cut him off. I didn't need his version of events. I needed space. Mom stammered. Dad started shouting about disrespect. I ended the call. I dropped the phone, exhaling the breath I'd been holding. My heart was racing, but something in me finally unlocked. I looked around Grandma's living room, the soft glow of the lamp on her crocheted blanket, and realized I wasn't trapped anymore. Tomorrow, I'd go back to school and finish the semester without letting Brian define me. My parents might never understand, and he might keep spinning tales, but I had my own voice now, and that was enough.